their data, which is what I'm going to do today. I will go point by point and demonstrate just how clearly we are being lied to. Now, by the way, I have all the source material for every point that I'm talking about at the booth over here, so if you'd like to come join me afterwards, disagree, agree, want to learn more, come talk to me afterward. So, right out of the gate, there were three major mistakes, or so we're led to believe, that collectively led to the illusion of severity of what we're dealing with today. One, you probably all know, was Neil Ferguson in the Imperial College of London, creating one of his many government agenda supporting subjective models that falsely claimed the infection fatality rate was 3.6%. We all know that's not true. They've admitted that's not true, but that's what created it in the beginning. Now, then, as if to support this illusion, Fauci mistakenly, again we're told, confused what's called infection fatality rate with case fatality rate, which, just to make it simple, is an easy way to over-exaggerate the problem. And later he let it go unnoticed that even the correct usage of the infection fatality rate was using what's called relative risk reduction instead of absolute risk reduction. And for those that don't know these things, bottom line, it means it's a way to exaggerate what's really happening. And somebody like Fauci knows better than this. Now, with all the praise being thrown in Fauci's direction, these are some monumental mistakes. One might even say career-ending if we lived in an honest world. Now, even with this clear illusion of severity, they still needed to bolster the numbers, which brings me to my first point, which is what I refer to as PIC. Many may not even know what that is. It stands for pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19. You can look this right on there. You can look at the CDC website right now, and it's prominently posted as PIC. Now, what this is a combination of pneumonia, influenza, and COVID numbers being put together and shown to you as COVID risk. That's inaccurate. Now, yes, there is such a thing as secondary infections, which is how they point to that. But the point about secondary infections is an association, not the entire problem. And as I go through, you'll see more that we're finding that it's predominantly something other than what they're telling you is the problem, and yet saying that is the ultimate point. Now, an illusion that we're talking about today in regard to combining these things has been used long before COVID-19 to push flu vaccine sales. As even the WHO called out itself in 2011, and even the British Medical Journal and the Health and Human Services called out in 2018, according to the HHS, 62,034 people died from the flu in the year 2001, 61,777 of which were attributed to pneumonia, 257 to the flu alone. That's a fact. Yet this total was used nonetheless to push injections for the flu. And a similar situation is 1918 Spanish flu, which, if you guys understand the history and you look it up on Wikipedia, not that that makes it actually accurate, but that it's there, that predominantly, even according to Dr. Fauci's own research on the topic, in 1918, the predominant vast majority, were their words, were pneumonia. Now, there's a lot to be discussed around that one point, but the bottom line is, if this is what we're talking about, isn't this a pneumonia pandemic with a side of COVID? Or some other variation thereof? The bottom line is that's not the full picture, and most people do not know that fact. Now, the same thing is happening today. And this is made comically clear when the flu just up and vanishes. No longer happens this year, right? Because the flu, and the funny part about that topic is, guess what they tell you? Oh, it's because everyone's wearing their mask. They're all social distancing. But if you ask, well, why is COVID coming up again? Well, it's because nobody's wearing their mask and everybody's not social distancing. And those things happen simultaneously. And it's ridiculous. Now, anything resembling flu-like symptoms today is likely deemed COVID. And this is even expressed by many people in authority because they're doing it to keep you safe. But the problem is, if you're using numbers that you're admitting are inaccurate, you can't use those numbers to force people into positions they don't want to be in. You can't use false information to remove people's freedom. Now, anything resembling those symptoms is being deemed COVID by using the next part of the illusion, which is the PCR test. I'd like to start with something you may not have heard about before. Maybe you have if you watch my show. It's called The Epidemic That Wasn't, from 2007. The New York Times actually wrote about this back when they were, I guess, remotely even trying to be honest. Who knows, maybe they had an agenda to do the truth at that time. But the point is, they wrote about it in 2007. And this is discussing a topic of a whooping cough epidemic. Now, at the time, they were convinced there was an epidemic. They shut the hospital down, people were given vaccines, they did everything you're seeing today, quarantines. And then, after months of that, they came back and said, oh, it turns out there was not a single case of whooping cough. You know why that happened? The doctors themselves spoke up and said, well, we were testing based on symptoms, and we used a test to make sure we could confirm that those symptoms were what we thought it was. And they said it turns out that our over-reliance on the PCR test was why we were led astray. That was in 2007. That's openly discussed. They knew this today. Now, whether or not that's chosen for the illusion we're talking about today, or it was a mistake, among the many claimed mistakes, is up for you to decide. But the point is, this was discussed, and those doctors themselves said, we need to think about this going forward because this will happen again. And they were right. Now, Dr. Scoglio, PhD, is one of many, many highly credentialed doctors that have spoken up and said, this is not the right tool. Now, he tested a kiwi fruit live on the air and it tested positive. There's been a lot of cases of that, I'm sure you've all seen. It's not a joke. Now, sure, you can have false positives, false negatives, and all sorts of things on tests, but the point is, he made very clear that when you're using a cycle threshold on this test of 40 or 45, or above 40, it's upwards of 95% false positives. Now, you might not be shocked to find out that the majority of this country currently verifiably uses above 40 cycle threshold for their tests. Now, if you don't know what that means, it's a simple, to make it simple, it's a way of increasing your magnification to look closer at what you're looking at. However, when the closer you get, the more convoluted it becomes, to make it very simple. And these doctors are telling you that they go over 40, it makes it impossible. Now, what's interesting is Fauci himself was on the record in 2020 on a podcast on Today in Virology, I believe it's called, very prominent. He himself stated exactly that if you use a cycle threshold over 35, the test is not replication competent, meaning it doesn't work. And here we are. So if Fauci can say that in 2020 live on the air, I can prove to you we're using over 40 right now. How is that not an illusion? Creating false positives. Now, we've seen a lot of these in general from before. We've seen them talk about 28 days in a positive test, right? That's happening in the UK right now. If you get a positive test with that possible false positive, and then you get in a car accident 27 days later, you're a COVID-19 death. That's admitted to. Of course, it's for your safety, right? But again, if it's going to be an overshot number that's inaccurate, you can't use it to remove people's freedoms. Now, before that even, symptoms and just circumstances were being used. Remember this. They said, well, they got the sniffles and they're coughing and then they're in a bad high area zone. Well, we're going to call that COVID-19. And they've admitted to all of this. Now, the bottom line on the cycle threshold is that the breakthrough cases today, they're calling after the injection. Guess what cycle threshold they're using? Can you guess? Under 28. How do you not recognize the intentional deception if they're using something that guarantees it will look less on one side, or you could argue more accurate, and on the other side, it guaranteed to make sure you have a higher number? It's quite simple, guys. These are deceptions. Now, the intention, again, you can debate, but these are deceptions. I guess I should stop for a second to let you guys clap if I have to. Now, Kary Mullis is somebody you're probably familiar with, the person who invented this test. Now, I want to read you a direct quote that he stated before he died. PCR is intended to identify substances qualitatively, but by its very nature is unsuited for estimating numbers. Although there is a common misimpression that the viral load tests actually count the number of viruses in the blood, these tests cannot detect free infectious viruses at all. They can only detect proteins that are believed, in some cases wrongly, to be unique to HIV. The test can detect genetic sequences of viruses, but not viruses themselves. Now, yes, this was being discussed in the context of HIV. That's the commonly used way to dismiss this. But what he's generally saying is the last part of this. The test can detect genetic sequences of viruses, but cannot detect viruses themselves. And yet we're using this for that exact purpose. There's your illusion. Now, this brings me to the emergency use authorization. One of these many pillars of the ways we're being deceived. Now, these are emergency authorizations, both for individual uses, like the tests I just described, which are indeed emergency authorized for your use, even though we're not in an emergency, which I'm getting to. Masks, injections, all emergency authorized, as well as for the country in general. Those are two different things, but equally important on how they're being used to pretend you're in a dangerous situation that necessitates things that we're not fully sure about, but just in case. And that doesn't make sense. Now, all of these are based on the verifiable lies that we just discussed. We are not in an emergency at this moment, even based on the US government's own pandemic chart from before COVID started. And that's easily looked up. Even more interesting, the United Kingdom, as of March 19th, 2020, on their own website states, quote, COVID-19 is no longer considered to be a high consequence infectious disease, end quote. It still says that right now. I don't even understand how that makes sense. Now, without the emergency use authorization, their pandemic powers and illusion of legitimacy, which is really what this gives them, are dramatically restricted. If that emergency is removed, they don't have this quasi-authority they're using right now. They might still do it, but it gives us more power over them, which is really what was supposed to be happening today. The government works for you. That's how this is supposed to work. Now, this is why it continues right now, the emergency use, based on the lingering after effects. And that's not a joke. Right now, on the original emergency statement, it said based on the threat of COVID-19. If you look at the ones since then, every 90 days they have to renew it. It now says based on the after effects, what it has done, which is a guaranteed way to make sure this never ends. There will always be something they point to say we're still in this emergency because. Same with the Patriot Act and plenty of other things they've used ongoing that have never gone away, that have been used to remove your freedoms under a guise of keeping you safe. Now, as it became more widely known that Neil Ferguson was yet again incorrect, which I think is really important to understand, that I think at least 5 catastrophically important times he has been very seriously wrong that leaned on the side of what the government wanted. That's not hard to see, and yet again with COVID-19. But when the time came where people were like, obviously that's incorrect and he made mistakes, they then pivoted to the illusory threat of asymptomatic spread. This is because we're going, well, yes, it's not as dangerous as we said, but we don't know. It could be out there. That person could be sick. We don't know, right? This is how they got people worked up. Now, Fauci himself has stated that respiratory viruses spread by symptoms before this all started, right? And this is this has been the common understanding. Now, there's been a 10 million person strong study that showed that out of 10 million people they tested, only 300 of them were shown to be asymptomatic. Guess how many of those 300 were transmissible? 0. You know why? Because they didn't have symptoms. And they weren't spreading. And now this has been used as well to turn the focus back on children. Children that have a 0% risk, statistically speaking, in every possible factor you can look at. And I'll start talking about that more in a second. They're using the asymptomatic concept to say, well, we don't know, those kids could spread it to you. Science is what we're talking about today, right? They keep telling us, trust the science, trust the science. And then they use something like this, which is 100% based on fear. We don't know. That kid could be sick. That's not science, that's fear-mongering. Now, this led us predictably to the promotion of lockdowns. Obviously, we don't know. We have to lock down because there's danger everywhere, right? This keeps people in fear. This is another way that maintains the illusion. Because if you think you're in fear, if you think there's a problem, well, you're going to continue acting like there's a problem. Now, this increases people's illness. Now, this has been shown in every study I can find around what lockdowns are doing now and what they've done before. That's an also important point. Before this all started, there's plenty of scientific research that said lockdowns were not the way to go. In fact, the word that was used was archaic. But we ignored that because government said it. But it increases your illness, mental illness, physical illness, emotional illness. In fact, it lowers your immune system for many reasons I could point out. All of this leads to more illness, which then is otherwise, in some cases, labeled COVID-19. It isolates you from your friends, your family, and I find this to be an incredibly important point. It stops you from, in many cases, being able to converse about what's going on with your family. Talking at the dinner table, what's going on? Did you agree with that? I heard something different. When you're separated from people around you, you don't do that. And that is something that I think has led us on a very dangerous path, along with a lot of other things. Now, interestingly enough, the WHO has come out after all this and said, well, lockdowns are not the primary method we should be using. Now, what's interesting is before, your government said, well, you can't challenge the WHO guidelines. You can't do that. And then suddenly the WHO said, well, we shouldn't be using lockdown. They said, well, we disagree. We're going to keep doing it. And they did. All of them. UK, United States, they all do it. Now, what's interesting is it shows you the illusion that they're using to shut people like me down. Oh, you can't challenge the WHO says. We're going to censor your information, but we'll do it if we see fit. These are all examples of how they are deceiving you and creating an illusion. Now, of course, no discussion of the COVID-19 illusion is complete without the topic of masks. We all know this. The part of the illusion that masks are filling just cannot be overstated. Next to the PCR test, I truly feel that the mask is the largest part of this deception. On one hand, it obviously maintains the illusion of severity. This has been discussed many times. You walk around and half the people are masked. Well, even if you don't agree with it, you think, well, there's probably something going on. It keeps you feeling in this constant state of threat. But it also actually creates the severity itself. Now, this is a hard thing for some people to understand. The scientific research from before this, as Starla pointed out as well, the studies they've done have shown you one important statement: not statistically significant. It does not have a statistically significant effect on stopping transmission. There was a random control trial done on cloth masks, the only one that I've seen done. Now that has shown you very clearly, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it increases the risk of infection. It leads to things like bacterial pneumonia. Now, interesting thing about that is bacterial pneumonia creates the symptoms that look just like COVID-19. Bacterial pneumonia can be spread to somebody else. Okay, so you can see this little perfect circle of illusion just between mask, PCR test, and what they're telling you is happening. You're wearing a mask, it's creating something that's being called COVID-19, it can spread to somebody else, they catch it, spread to somebody else, all of this is being labeled something it's not. That is possible. I say possible because it's not everywhere. I believe it's happening almost everywhere. That's my opinion. Now, at this point, it's important to point out a very important grouping of work that's been done by the Swiss Policy Research. One of its huge studies found that the average age of death from these alleged COVID-19 cases showed that COVID mortality was right in line with natural mortality. And this is very interesting, right? And people may ask, how is that possible? How is that possible? Well, they are combining and averaging everyone's risk. That's what we have to understand, even though the vast majority are not at risk. Now, whether or not you agree with that is irrelevant, because they're telling you that if you just listen. If you look at the CDC's information, they pointed this out, I forget exactly how long ago, months ago, maybe longer. Only 6% died from COVID alone. Of all the deaths we've seen, only 6% died from COVID alone. That's from the CDC's own website. That means that 94% of people that died, they're telling you is COVID-19, died, as they tell you, with a minimum, or average, of 2.6 other comorbidities. They were sick. And in many cases, we're talking about people that were already in the hospital. They were in the hospital with illnesses, maybe a broken leg. And they go, oh, well, since you're here, we need to test and make sure you're not sick with the test that has a high false positive rate. And they go, well, now you've got COVID-19. Now, even if they're let out of the hospital, that still goes down as a COVID hospitalization. And if they die in that hospital, that goes down as a COVID death. They're open and honest about all this stuff. I shouldn't say honest, but they're admitting all of this stuff in very dishonest ways. Now, a meta-analysis that I talk about frequently on my show, almost done, is of the 113 infection fatality rate studies. That's the meta-analysis of all of them, and it tells you that if you're under 10, you have a risk of 0.002%. Now, that's including all of these. That's averaging this stuff out. Now, if you look at the Oxford calculator that they tell you should be listening to, and you do the math, you do the information for a 19-year-old person or younger, it says literally 1 in a million. That's not a joke. 1 in a million. We use that as a joke. It's 1 in a million. That means to us it's not possible, right? They're telling you people 19 or younger have a 1 in a million chance of getting this, and yet they're forcing something in their arm, in many cases, that increases that risk verifiably. So whether we're talking about myocarditis, which they just admitted was an increased risk, not just some, but everyone.